you've got an opportunity for about 20 minutes to get into the discussion, ask some key questions. I'm reminded, listening to those presentations, of a line that the former Commissioner for the Future, Dr. Peter Elliott, used, that the path, and we don't have a Commissioner for the Future anymore, but he used a line that I recall, that the path to the future is not discovered, it's created. And I guess that's one of the challenges for us today, is how we see the adaptation to the changing environment. How do we actually create that path of the future? I thought there were some sobering comments today. The adapt, migrate, and die is reasonably sobering. Peter Heyman also made an important point that, in fact, adaptation never stops, or adaptation never stops, which I think is also important to realise. And I would point out that whilst the Goyder's line goes through my property on the way that day, Wayne Meyer, I picked up on the point theme by saying the future will be different, and finally Doug with his comments about tough decisions, but I think the point of hope, there's a lot we can do. So now it's up to you. What can we do? Do you have any burning questions from what you've heard this morning? Yes.
Ben Hurd from Big Climate Consulting. I have two questions, one for Andrew and then one for Doug. Andrew, in a situation where perhaps people are willing to engage in carbon farming issue and do some large landscape scale plantings that might overlap with areas that are regarded as vulnerable or needing something a little better planned for resilience, how accessible would knowledge be to actually make sure that is right, sometime over the next 5-year period, or is that still a little way off to get good direction there? And my question for Douglas was, in the event of planned retreat, is there the thought that perhaps rather than simply retreating and create a space, that we might actually engineer that space to do a better job of whatever it is we're trying to retreat from, i.e. make it some area of land that might accommodate a seasonal rise better than it previously did.
Okay, so good question. I think as soon as you produce some scientific results that are potentially of interest, then the issue is in the translation of those. So in terms of restoring communities, actually we're working with NGO organisations like Green Australia and also Trees for Life to define policies around restoration based on these results. We hope to have some simple guidelines that are produced within the next 2 years to do that. But basically, the recommendations that we're making at the moment is that go with the species that already occur within that area, but go for a genetically diverse stock for replanting. So take seed from several different areas. You can take seed from a slightly northerly location and mix that with a local stock as well. And you may also consider planting species which have a more northerly distribution as well, but are still found at that site. So planting for the future, I think, is one of the principles that we're looking at.
Thanks very much for the question. I think engineering in relation to coastal risks are clearly part of the solution, and that's been really the focus up till now. But the future risks of sea level rise suggest that we're going to have to build higher walls, bigger breakwaters, etc., etc. If we can be clever about where we can retreat from developments in certain spaces, and we focused on the Fleurieu region, but we've had a broader study with Professor Graham Hugo looking at the Asia-Pacific region and the future of human mobility in relation to that with the Asian Development Bank. This is going to be an enormous challenge, that people are living in situations where they're flooded regularly in parts of Bangladesh and Vietnam, and they're living with it, but at some stage people move away. You need to move key infrastructure away and people will move away. So we also have to acknowledge that there will be mobility as part of our adaptation response, and we have to put in place policies that allow and support that mobility effectively. We're starting to see it around Australia, Byron Bay, Lakes Entrance, the Macquarie area in New South Wales has started to implement plan to treat policies. They're extremely controversial, and to understanding those controversies and resourcing them effectively to get around some of those governance problems.
Sorry, so what do we leave behind? I mean, can we leave behind a wetland, or leave behind a mangrove, or leave behind something that's going to...
It will depend on the place. Dune systems, mangroves, natural systems that are able to buffer the risk for coastal change. We've seen some great adaptation along the metropolitan foreshore. We've been fantastic here at Brighton Seacliff, for example, a good example of where we rebuilt those dunes back into the system. And there's some great examples of coast protection, and the Coast Protection Board has been really at the forefront, I think, out in responding to these challenges. And new challenges isn't just stopping development, but retreating from areas that are at risk, and that is going to be a curly question for governments.
Okay, well, let's open up the discussion. Would someone like to follow up on that theme, or pick up on another area? Over there and then down the front.
So my name's Sandy Collins, I'm from Germany. I just had a question on leadership. So what's the difference between climate change adaptation happening with good leadership versus learning the market, or just emergencies and responses, dictate what happens?
Who'd like to tackle that one? Can I just lead into that? I was thinking of the comments that Peter made, and also the reference to retreat and the idea of just let the market work. Well, in actual fact, if we go back to Goyder, it wasn't a very orderly retreat, I have to say. There are lots of ruined homes there. And I'd suggest that if we drew another line today, let's say for argument's sake we call it the Hayman line, that'd be a point. So, who would like to tackle the question?
Yeah, I think so. My dealing with agriculture and something, I think it is important to recognise that we have a free market economy, and we have a whole lot of individuals making a whole lot of decisions, and that has problems. But also, as someone who works with government, there's market failure. There's also government failure too. I mean, it is a complexity there. I do think we have some really good leadership in rural communities, and I think so. Without on the Peninsula, the NRM board there, under the leadership there, took real leadership positions, and quite difficult at times. But I can think of that being repeated at many times, where farmers have kind of stood up and said, this isn't just variability, there's also some change going on here, and we have to have that conversation. I think one of the really interesting things about climate change is it throws up this question of what's the appropriate land use here, in a way that hasn't been open. There's always been some crazies who've had that conversation, but it opens up to a wider group of people. And I guess I'm pretty optimistic about how that's sort of happening in a combination of free market economies with really leadership. But the leadership has to be from behind, because leadership in NRM in Australia is very, the powers are very weak. You can have all sorts of plans, but what you can really do, I think, is still very limited in the free market economy.
Yeah, just a comment on that. When you think about markets and the role that they play, they're very strongly reactive in the sense that they are often, and if they have a projection, it's often very short term. Whereas the whole role of leadership is really about preparing ourselves and being anticipatory. And this issue of climate change needs us to be anticipatory rather than waiting for the crisis. You know, if we look at human history, we are very good at responding to crises, and we'll undertake deprivation to deal with the crisis. But the real issue is here, we might not be able to deal with the crisis. We have to anticipate and prepare ourselves before it comes. That's the role of leadership, and markets will be insufficient to solve that problem.
Okay. Just one of the points about ecosystems and biodiversity. I mean, of course, much of the value that we derive from those is not part of our formal economic system. So leaving the sustainability of those systems to be open to free market economy is just not going to work. Now we're seeing changes with carbon sequestration and various other carbon market drivers that is partially addressing those. But we have to look at social goods policy avenues for that type of care of those systems.
Okay, we have a question down the front.
Thanks. Mark Stevens, a couple of years ago I was involved with the climate change adaptation planning process and the SA and the D. It struck me at the time that we really were comfortable talking about climate variability, but then when we started talking about climate change around 2 degrees, we really started to push the boundary a bit more. My feeling is in the last year when we were out in regional communities is a little bit more comfort in talking about more severe climate change scenarios, and then when we marry that with the World Bank talking perhaps around planning for 4 degrees, I wonder whether we need to start moving more towards talking around that range. My question though is, are we ready to communicate what 4 degrees warming means, and is the science there?
Yes, we're ready with the science. We're making a range of predictions up to 4 degrees. I think part of the problem of translating those extreme scenarios is you almost get a paralysis type scenario. I think going towards that almost gives a no hope kind of message. And I think moving up to 4 degrees, so planning for 1 degree, 2 degree, 4 degrees, I think we should plan within those kinds of scenarios. But yes, we're ready for the science.
I think within agriculture, 4 degrees, it's not a very interesting question. I mean, it's just obvious what's going to happen. So when I was at Sydney Uni, someone was doing a PhD on how a nuclear war wouldn't be good for wheat growth. And it's a devastating outcome, and you can do a whole lot of analysis to show that there'll be a whole lot of problems with that. But it's sort of obviously 4 degrees is extremely sensitive. And it is a way off, and really it's in some ways, let's just hope we don't get there. But doing detailed wheat modelling of 4 degrees, I don't see the point.
Okay, that nuclear
future. A question of the relationship between climate change and, I'm from Gina, climate change and ecosystems. You mentioned that we're rebuilding dunes along the coast, for example, and that's a good thing, and that's why I'm involved in that, so I think that is a good thing. But do we know what the impact of rising sea levels is on those coastal ecosystems, how dunes systems will in fact survive those impacts? What will be the changes to those ecosystems? And the efforts we're putting into things like saving little plovers that could be endangered and nest on the high tide lines, is that just us doing feel-good things, or is that really worthwhile activity and effort?
I'll leave it to Murray to elaborate on the specifics of the coastal issues, but I think we have to start moving into it. It comes a little bit back to the previous question as well. It's an inertia in society about managing things that are linear change. So we know that if we put in dunes, we'll be able to manage the sea level rise, or non-linear change, where we'll get major shifts in the way that things happen. So suddenly the way that we've managed the coast in the past with dunes, which has worked, won't work anymore. Or the way that we manage an irrigation system, such as very efficient irrigation systems in South Australia, won't work anymore because we won't be getting the water down the Murray. That's the idea of conceptualising responses, that this is how we could manage within a normal curve for responses. This is when we're right at the edge of the normal curve in relation to non-linear change. Then we're going to have to start thinking about new ways of doing it. And that's why I think conceptualising things within this concept of planned retreat is useful, because we're going to have to retreat in relation to our natural resource quality and quantity quite fundamentally in some areas in a new way of responding, where suddenly the old ways won't be appropriate anymore.
Those species still need those habitats. They may move further south as climate change pressures come on, but new bird species, new coastal bird species may move into those habitats that are left over from other ones. I think we've got to get used to this idea of a changing system. But from the natural ecosystems, you're still going to need those blocks in the landscape where native species live. The exact composition of species may change slightly over time, so we've got to get used to changing, managing that change.
Okay, well that's where we have to wrap it up. Would you join me in thanking our 4 speakers?